Good Tuesday evening, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to the Hurricane Hub discussion for May 30th, 2023. Let's get right on with it and right to the National Hurricane Center, where we have indeed another area of interest in the Gulf of Mexico this time. The last few area of interest we've had, if you remember, one off the Carolinas coast this past weekend, and then there was another one a few days before that, both in the general regions of the subtropics near the Bahamas, this one in the Gulf of Mexico, though. And there's indeed talk about this potentially trying to do something, especially over the next few days as it heads into Florida for this weekend, potentially bringing some heavy rain. And so you might want to watch out for that. Heavy rain, maybe I think gusty winds, but mostly rainfall for Florida. And some models are potentially picking up on this, trying to develop, although there is still a little bit of uncertainty on whether or not it tries to get going. We'll have to see what happens though, but we'll go over models shortly in just a bit. But really quickly, the Eastern Pacific, not much going on there over the next 7 days as expected. But I did want to show the satellite image for this, and it does actually look pretty interesting. There is definitely some sort of rotation and spin with it in the atmosphere, and you'll see that on the 850 millibar vorticity in just a little bit. So there is definitely some sort of atmospheric kick to it. This does have some sort of structure that, if conditions are favorable enough, this might maybe try. The waters are definitely warm in the Gulf, and I'll actually show this right now. I'll take a look at the sea surface temperatures in the Gulf, and notice the only really cold spot that we're looking at in the Gulf of Mexico is right here in the northern panhandle, the northern peninsula, the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, closer towards the Florida panhandle, and that's where we're really only seeing water temperatures 26 degrees Celsius or lower. But the rest of where this is, which is roughly the path where most of the models seem to have it come over or kind of take a path, is right down here in the central and southeastern Gulf. And you notice all the water temperatures there, 27 and even some 28 degrees Celsius, more than enough for tropical cyclone development indeed. And you can see where it is right now. This is the 850 millibar vorticity. And if you're not familiar with what vorticity at 850 millibars is, it's basically spin. That's what we mean by vorticity, the amount of spin, counterclockwise spin, of course, since this is the northern hemisphere. How much of that is in the atmosphere? Around 5,000 feet up. That's what 850 millibars is. It's roughly in elevation in the atmosphere 5,000 feet up. And 5,000 feet up, we have decent vorticity in the Gulf of Mexico, certainly reaching closer towards oranges and darker yellows, closer towards gold, which definitely represents there is some vorticity there. And you could also see the very strong vorticity signature. I think this is actually associated with the Carolina feature we saw earlier in the week. If you remember, this past weekend, heavy rain, gusty winds to the Carolinas, I believe. This is a part of it, maybe. I'm not too sure, probably, but of course that is not expected to develop. It's not on the NHC page anyways, but this is the area we're talking about. And as I did say, there's definitely some spin to it. You could also see on the satellite, once again, you notice the turning in the atmosphere, so there's definitely something associated with it. Whether or not it gets going is a question. And of course, things are right now, when it comes to development, and it'll certainly definitely take its time, because just look at it, wind shear all over the place, except for a small spot in the Gulf of Mexico. I think that's where this is roughly. I guess so. This is roughly in the southern Gulf, but surrounding that area, across the entire rest of the Gulf, there's higher wind shear. Red, of course, wind shear being unfavorable for tropical cyclone development. Of course, when we talk about tropical cyclone development, we talk about thunderstorms being vertically stacked in the atmosphere. And when we have wind shear, strong upper level winds, strong winds vertically in the atmosphere, that's what we call wind shear. That pushes those storms atop and kind of pushes them apart and keeps them disorganized from vertically stacking, which is why we always say wind shear usually is very unfavorable for development of tropical cyclones, usually, because there are some cases where it indeed helped, in a way, storms, at least with its outflow, but that's more of a less of a situation, separate situations that tend to happen, not too often, but sometimes. There are indeed interesting situations, and they've actually happened with storms that we've had infamous storms that we've had in the past. But of course, it will take its time to develop. There is some atmospheric situations it needs to deal with before it gets to Florida. But hey, it is on the ensembles, and some models are indeed supporting it. This is the European ensemble, by the way. This is from courtesy of weathernerds.org, another website that you'll definitely be seeing a lot more throughout the season. This posts ensembles from the European, even GFS ensemble forecast, which is sometimes better to look at than the actual operational model themselves, because ensembles mean the different variations, different runs of the same model that show different ideas. That's what it basically is, the European ensemble, which has a total of 51 members, so 51 different variations of the European running. And this is what they show, and you see definitely a defined signal for some sort of track coming in from the Gulf, then goes on off into Florida. Then somewhere a majority of these ensembles really strengthen off the southeast coast. Maybe that could happen. I mean, certainly water temperatures are definitely warmer within this vicinity, as well as in the Gulf as well, and then also towards the end of the run. And why not loop it? Let's loop it for a little bit and actually crank up the speed, because I don't want to be sitting here for a while. But you see here ensembles on the European showing some sort of defined signal, and some of them even actually have quite strong low pressures. So I think I saw some 980s, multiple 980s, and even some 970s in there. And then I think closer towards the end of the run, they kind of show some sort of low pressure developing right here near Central America. Hold on, let me see it. Let's see if I can see it there. And then, hey, look, even something in the Eastern Pacific. But of course, we'll see if that's an actual signal or not, as of course the end of this model run does go out to 240 hours out. And anyways, there is a little bit of disagreement on the European, between the GFS and the European, on what exactly this system does, but we'll go over that in a little bit shortly. But of course, really quickly, wanting to look at the wide shot of the Atlantic, and you generally see the same thing we've been talking about. Of course, that area in the Gulf of Mexico, then we have a lot of moisture streaming from the Caribbean. I assume a lot of rain for Cuba and portions of Hispaniola, the islands, and then Bahamas, and then it kind of stretches up into this big front off the east coast. And certainly you could see when we talk about, let's go back to the 850 millibar vorticity. We go back to this earlier. Certainly not going to develop, because look at the satellite. There's no sort of organized convection, so definitely not really something tropical in entity. So no need to worry for tropical development for that, but generally probably some heavy rains associated with this. Seems like there's a front, and I think even maybe Bermuda somewhere in there as well, maybe getting some rain. Yeah, Bermuda right here. So maybe Bermuda getting some rain, and then of course portions of the Caribbean as well. And then after that, you could see just a bunch of upper level stronger winds cutting across the Atlantic. You can see by those clouds here a lot of strong upper level winds cutting across. You can see, especially by those upper level clouds, you can see them moving west to east. Wind shear definitely prevalent in the Atlantic, and until that goes away, we will not see development anytime soon. But of course, check the date. It is May 30th. I'm going into May 31st, because this does go by UTC Zulu time. So by now, 8 o'clock Eastern time, it's already on May 31st in Zulu time there. So heading into the last week, the last day of May, of course, not going to expect anything to develop anyways outside in the MDR region. That's usually not something that we see till later, but sea surface temperature anomalies, definitely warm, and definitely, in my opinion, probably going to be an implication of later. Take a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies by the NOAA Coral Reef Watch, of course, updated as of yesterday, although they do update every single day, so I guess you trade a negative for a positive. But I mean, how much change really occurs in a day anyway? But anyways, sea surface temperature anomalies out there in the MDRs, same as we've been talking about for weeks, very warm, and certainly a very interesting look on top of this developing El Nino off the coast of South America, very warm as well. But if you compare it to the last 2 weeks, we've definitely seen a cool down occur right off the coast of South America. Definitely does not look as defined. We saw a bunch more of these deep dark reds, even blacks, off the coast of South America. Anomalies were really warm there. Now we just see a bunch of these deep reds and more spotty dark reds there. So definitely maybe this kind of cooling off a little bit, but certainly the general warmth beginning to spread across across the Pacific, and of course there's a lot of warmth to go around in the Atlantic. But just very interesting because we really never seen an Atlantic this warm on top of a signature of an El Nino that we have for this year. And also very interesting enough, want to point out the colder part of the Baja Peninsula, more or less associated with what we call a negative PDO, basically meaning the northern Pacific is cold. And usually, and there's been certainly some talk about it this year, and in my opinion needs to be more looked into, usually in El Nino years, this is not necessarily something that we usually get. This is more indicative and more kind of a sign of the atmosphere kind of lingering on with some of the La Nina stuff that we had from the past 2 years, at least with the northern Pacific. The equatorial Pacific is definitely slowly beginning to respond to El Nino. If we take a look at SOI valleys and stuff like that, that is definitely on its trend towards El Nino. But this, especially when we combine that with the very warm Atlantic that we have right now, I just really find it interesting. You gotta watch to see these two, how they maybe kind of bunch up, especially if both of these persist. Because sure, we have them right now, but what really matters if this holds and remains in place for the next few months, till the season, which I'd honestly assume at this point it probably would, especially given that we're getting into summer and we usually start seeing less influencing factors. These factors on whether or not the waters will be warm or cold. Generally, climate factors start becoming less volatile on affecting these things. So generally, things that we have right now tend to stick around longer in the summer. So it would be very interesting to see how this persists and how does this affect hurricane season really. Because man, in any typical year, this would really be a sign of a very active Atlantic, and who knows, maybe that is a sign that the Atlantic is very active this year, despite El Nino. We'll have to find out and we'll have to see, but certainly something very interesting. But going on to the GFS, so of course, let's take a look at the models, especially given the area of interest in the Gulf. And as I did mention before, there is definitely some disagreement, and let's take a look at that on the GFS. And you can definitely see where the disagreement is. The GFS kind of just keeps this as a broad, very non-distinct low, with very little vorticity as well in the atmosphere. It kind of just mingles around in the Gulf and does nothing, and then kind of dies out after 5 days in the Gulf of Mexico. And then we look at past that up to 168 hours out. That's up to 7 days, and it's completely gone from the GFS. There's really nothing there. So you could definitely see the disagreement from the GFS and the Euro. Whereas we go towards the European model, let me pull it up. You can see they have that signature in the Gulf, and look what they do with it. Latest is the 12Z run, of course. The European kind of dingling this around in the Gulf for a little bit, then it moves it into Florida, and then notice very interesting as it gets closer towards Florida. We're looking at vorticity once again, the spin in the atmosphere. We start to see a little bit more of darker yellow and closer towards golden orange colors as this approaches Florida. And also take a look at these black lines too, determining isobars, and we see these closed ovalish isobars, definitely indicating that there is some sort of low pressure too. And you could even see these small wind barbs here as well, definitely these wind bars being an indicating factor of the wind direction at the surface. And notice those too. You see this kind of making out a counterclockwise formation, maybe some sort of broad low that does try to get going. Then this moves into Florida, and then off the east coast it develops, and we start seeing a bunch more of these reds beginning to pop up. And this is now up to hour 168. It kind of shoots out into the Atlantic, but you get the idea. The European is definitely a lot more aggressive with the development of this system, especially as it head towards Florida, as compared to the GFS. And I find this very interesting because usually in this type of situation, with you would assume convective feedback bias in the GFS, which is something notorious that the GFS has. You would assume that the GFS would be more aggressive, but very interested that the European is more into the system this time around. Maybe that could mean some sort of change with the outlook. We'll have to see, but certainly very interesting. And regardless, for Florida, watch out for heavy rains and maybe some gusty winds. And if this does develop into a system, potentially look for tropical storm force conditions, maybe. I don't know. We'll have to see. Not really banking on this developing right now, but as I did mention earlier, Gulf sea surface temperatures are warm, and it is turning the page on June. In fact, and as a reminder, since we are turning the page into June, if you don't know, if you haven't been following me for the last few years or so, you know I like to do a live stream on June 1st to kind of kick off the hurricane season. So I'm doing that. I did kind of promote this on videos for the past few days now, but I'm going to continue to do it because why not? You got to promote something in order to get audience and in order to get reaction. If you don't promote it at all, you're not going to get anyone. So kind of throwing it at your face right now. Join me June 1st, 7 o'clock this Thursday. I'm going to include predictions, new predictions. If you saw my predictions from April, I made predictions for the Atlantic. I'm going to make updated predictions for that for Thursday and Pacific, Eastern and Central Pacific. Specifically, I don't do Western Pacific predictions. I'm not really interested in the Western Pacific basin like that. So I will not be doing predictions for the Western Pacific, but for the Eastern and Central Pacific. Of course, you got to give love to our viewers that are in Mexico and maybe some in Hawaii. Of course, they are generally within the Northern American and, of course, Central Pacific parts of the world, which is not very far in relative locations to the Atlantic. So, of course, you got to give them attention too. And, of course, a little bit of fun. I'm going to have some of my friends on that I have in the weather community. You might know some of them if you've been following me long enough. So, of course, why not have some fun? Of course, not everything can be serious in life. So, why not, include a little bit of fun in that? What's the harm in that? Anyway, that does wrap up today's discussion. Of course, watching what occurs with this system. We'll have an update to you tomorrow. Till then, enjoy the rest of your evening. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed what you saw today, as they always say. Share with family and friends, and have a good night. See you tomorrow.